Thank you for joining us for this episode of Inside Town Hall. I'm your host, Madeline Shields. Voters have approved medical marijuana in South Dakota. Joining me today is City Councilor Greg Neitzert, who is going to talk about the law and logistics of rolling out the distribution of cannabis. Thank you for joining us. This is a huge topic, and I'm just going to throw it to you and say, where do we even begin with this?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Well, on July 1st, medical marijuana became legal through IM26, which has now been codified as SDCL 3420G. And with that, local governments have to make some decisions. Essentially, we can regulate things like the businesses, where they can be, how far they can be from each other, how far they can be from parks and schools. And we can address a few other things potentially, like are we going to allow smoking in public, and what do we do about the odors and things like that. So there's many decisions that we have to make, and there's still a lot of things that the state has to get done in the next few months.
So if it's legalized on July 1, when will it be ready for people to be able to get, they have to have a medical card. Can you explain a little bit about what that process is?
Sure, that's a very good question, and that's created a lot of confusion. As of July 1st, there are certain amounts, 3 ounces, that somebody could potentially possess and have a legal defense. Essentially, the criminal laws don't go away. They aren't repealed, but essentially there's an exception in the law that if you're a card holder or you have a written certification from a doctor, you would be able to possess a certain amount of marijuana. Now, you can't go to a store yet because IM26 gave the state until October 29th to create the rules that will govern all of these establishments, the businesses that manufacture it, that grow it, that test it, and that actually sell it, which they would call a dispensary, which we would think of as a retail store. And so you're not going to see that until probably October, and then starting in October, once somebody gets a license to cultivate, they can start to cultivate. That takes about 90 days to go from seed to cultivation, and then you have to do drying and some other manufacturing, and that'll take maybe another month. So realistically, you probably won't see people buying something in the store on state lands until probably middle of 2022.
Okay. What is there licensing? I mean, if somebody's interested in growing or distributing or however that works, what are some of those processes that they have to go through? Yeah,
and that's exactly what IM26 said, was that the Department of Health at the state has to set forth the rules that will say, what does a license look like? What do you have to do? And they released draft rules just a week ago, and those are about 105 pages long, and they go into great detail of you have to have this sort of security, you have to have these sorts of cameras, you have to have these sorts of locking doors, you can't let somebody in unless they have a card. This is the electronic system that you will use to verify they're a card holder and they haven't been revoked. This is the amount of THC that can be in the product. This is what the labeling of the products have to look like. It goes into a wide array of essentially what they have to look like, and the rules they'll have to follow, and the fees that they'll have to pay to get a license. And we also are given the power locally to create a license if we want, a local license. We can charge a fee, and we can set rules again as to where those businesses can be. So until the state gets those rules adopted, which they're looking at the beginning of October to get that done, somebody will not be able to apply for a license. But they'll have plenty of time to see what the rules are and do their planning if they think that they wanted to get into that industry.
Is there any, I read somewhere that some states are saying, if you're going to open some kind of dispensary or something that has to do with this medical marijuana, or even later recreational, if it continues to pass, that it has to be 50% owned by the state, not by the state, but a resident of the state. Is that anything that has been looked at here, that if, or can anybody from out of state just come in here and set up shop and be 100% sole owner?
I believe in IM26, I believe the rules stated that I think at least one person who was one of the owners had to be in state. Normally, you can't make rules like that, but as with many things with marijuana, since it's illegal under federal law, there's a lot of things that you can do that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do if it wasn't legal. In most cases, we couldn't require that the ownership has to be from a certain state or that there's residency. I believe it's one person at least has to be in-state, an in-state owner. Or reside in the state.
An owner an owner, not just an employee as well.
Yes.
So, yeah. Okay. So what what's next for the consumers? Like, if they, right now you said it's illegal to have a small amount.
3 ounces.
3 ounces.
If you are a card holder.
And that card obviously had to come from a different place, or no? What if it could have been issued out of state, or does it have to be issued here in South Dakota?
There are rules that govern out-of-state card holders. So if you're an out-of-state card holder and you come in-state, you can have some protection. There's specific rules that go into that. It has to be valid. It has to be for a debilitating condition, and there's some rules that have to be followed. And you have to be legitimately somebody who is out of state, who maybe moved into the state or is driving through the state. As a resident, you can't go out of state and get a card in another state and come back and claim that you're a non-resident card holder. So it's specifically made for people that potentially might be moving here or driving through the state. And I should mention that cards will not be issued until probably November of this year, until they stand up the program to issue cards. Until that happens, you can get what's called a written certification from a doctor, and that would act as essentially your card pursuant to state law until cards are issued. So during this gap, if somebody was able to get a written certification, which is what you have to get from a doctor to get a card in the first place. The cards are issued by the state, and the doctor has to certify that A, you have a debilitating condition, and B, they believe that you would get a benefit from medical marijuana.
And maybe you can't speak for the Department of Health, but how are they getting all of this information on how to create these rules and regulations in the state of South Dakota?
They're looking at other states, because you have 36 states where medical is legal, 18 where recreational is legal, and so there's a lot that you can learn from looking at other states. It's a very steep learning curve, and they've been working on it for quite a while, and the rules are quite extensive, and so they've got those out for draft, and they're going to be taking public input on those, and then they're going to release another draft and go through a formal adoption process, and like I said, to have those effective by October. And when you look at them, it looks much like you see in many other states, and so they're trying to learn the lessons of implementations in other states.
What are you hearing in terms of city council and city government? Is this a difficult task, or is it going to be routine, I guess, since other states have already done this?
In ways, I think it's going to be difficult. In some ways, it's actually maybe more simple than maybe one might realize. It's difficult in the sense that it's an incredibly steep learning curve. This is something that we've never done before. This is new to this state, and even though it's legal in other states, this state law is unique, and we have to work within that framework. And the voters passed it, so obviously we all want to honor the will of the voters, but there's obviously downsides to any controlled substance being legal. So you're trying to figure out how do you address those. The concern maybe isn't so much somebody who is a card holder who has a debilitating medical condition. The concern is diversion to people that shouldn't have it, abuse of it, getting into the hands of children, just like alcohol, tobacco, painkillers, anything that's a controlled substance that can create downsides if it's used incorrectly. So trying to navigate that is really trying to navigate balancing the will of the voters and keeping with that, but also doing it in a responsible manner so you minimize the downsides.
Are you hearing from law enforcement any concerns or questions about how they will deal with the medical marijuana use, and then as it progresses into possibly recreational?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been talking to law enforcement and from multiple levels, and of course they have concerns because they see the downsides of illicit use of marijuana every day. And so, they obviously will honor the policy that is set by the people and by lawmakers, and they've made that very clear. But it certainly will create some challenges. So, there are some issues as it relates to things like probable cause, and when they approach a car maybe and they smell marijuana, it's not going to be a black or white issue anymore. There's now going to have to be a series of questions. And each county, through their state's attorneys and the Highway Patrol and Sioux Falls Police Department, all are making their own determination as to how they're going to address it. But they're essentially going to have to go through, if they smell marijuana, there's going to be some sort of a questioning of, do you have a card? Do you have it available? If you don't, do you have a written certification? But there's certain things for which, whether you have a card or not, you cannot be intoxicated. So if you're showing signs of impairment, you likely would be arrested or at least tested. So you cannot smoke in a car, and nor can your passengers, whether they're card holders or not. If you're under the age of 18, you can't have marijuana. So I mean, there's some things that are still black and white, but there's going to be some where they're going to have to make that judgment call. Does this person have a certain amount? And they've mentioned that there's certain things that they would like maybe clarified in state law to make enforcement easier of this. And so one of the things the state has to do is set up a 24-hour hotline that law enforcement would be able to contact at any time, so they can verify somebody is a legitimate card holder and that it isn't maybe a forged card. And so that's going to have to be stood up by October or November as well.
Okay. We're talking about smoking marijuana, whether it's recreational or medical. Will there be other products that come along with this, like the edibles that come along?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because when people think of marijuana, as you noted, many times people just think of smoking. But what's very popular now, there's many forms of ingesting marijuana. There's vaping it. There's edibles, which can be liquids. There can be foods, which can look like, you can have gummies, you can have chocolates, you can have those things. Some of those things, which unfortunately could be mistaken by children and have THC in them. There are oils and tinctures, things that you maybe put a drop onto your tongue. And there's topical ointments as well. All of them have different, what they would call, uptake rates, as far as like when they kick in, and then how long it lasts, and then how long that it comes back down. And so some of those things like vaping and things like that is the quickest onset, and then edibles can take maybe up to 1 or 2 hours. And sometimes people may take another one thinking that it's not working, and then get more than they should have. So yes, there's many forms, and that's what you would see in stores is a wide variety of ways in which to ingest cannabis or marijuana.
Can you talk a little bit about the joint task force that has been studying this?
Yeah, so in short, IM 26 gave local governments the authority to address where do we want stores to be? Do we want to allow stores? Do we want to set a certain number of how many there can be? We can potentially set numbers. And I should be clear that there's actually 4 what they call medical cannabis establishments. One is a cultivation facility, essentially where you grow it. One is manufacturing, where you make the products like the foods and the liquids. A testing facility, which has to be an independent lab that has no financial tie to any medical marijuana of those others, essentially so that they are independently testing and verifying that it's safe, it doesn't have pesticides in it, it has the same amount of THC as what is stated, and so they're an independent lab for basically quality control testing. And then dispensaries, which are the storefronts. We must allow at least 1 dispensary. We can say no to the other 3. So we have to come up with our local regulations, and when we say local, that's not just city, that's also county, but it also includes what we call our joint jurisdictional area. There's about a 3-mile ring outside of the city of Sioux Falls in which both the county, Minnehaha or Lincoln, depending on where you're at, and the city have to agree on zoning changes. So if we want to regulate these businesses, we both the county and the city in both cases have to create regulations and vote on them to adopt those. And that's what this joint task force is really talking about. It includes members from Lincoln, Minnehaha, and the city of Sioux Falls, 2 members from each body. And we're essentially talking about what kind of framework could we create to come up with an ordinance that we can bring to those joint bodies, because we have to get laws in place for those so that those places just outside of the city limits would be also regulated. So, because both bodies have to approve that.
And so that would be up to the county. So the sheriff's office would have to regulate or enforce if it's just outside the city limits, is that correct?
Well, actually, interestingly, so the Department of Health at the state level is given most of the authority as it relates to enforcement. Now, law enforcement does have certain powers, like, for example, the rules would allow law enforcement to go in at any time, but as it would relate to just, SNAP inspections and going in to make sure all the rules are being followed, that's really inside of the business. That really is the purview of the Department of Health. But of course, as it relates to just marijuana enforcement in general, yes, you would be talking about the county sheriffs as it would relate outside of the city limits. and inside of the city limits would be the Sioux Falls Police Department. As it relates to the criminal part of it, people that are illegally possessing it or using it and things like that outside of the business. So.
Sure. Okay, well, we are visiting with City Councilor Greg Neitzert about the legalization of medical marijuana, and we have a lot more to discuss. We will be back in just a moment.
How do we end this pandemic? Well, vaccines are the very best tools we have. Researchers and scientists have used a gold standard process to ensure the vaccine for COVID-19 is safe and effective. The same strict guidelines required by the FDA to license all vaccines in the U.S. have been followed. Do your part to keep your family and community safe. Getting vaccinated will help end this pandemic so we can get back to normal. For more, visit covid.sd.gov.
Welcome back to Inside Town Hall, where I am visiting with City Councilor Greg Neitzert, and we are talking about the legalization of medical marijuana and possibly the legalization of recreational marijuana. So let's continue our conversation about growing the plants. Is that possible to grow in the city limits, and could it be an existing building or an existing business, for instance, a greenhouse that's already operating?
Sure. The answer to that as of right now is no. We, as with many local governments, passed an ordinance essentially saying that we're not going to accept applications for permits or licenses for any medical cannabis establishment, which would include the cultivation or what we would think of as a greenhouse, until those rules come out from the state and we adopt ordinances. So as of right now, no. That is a decision the City Council will have to make, which is, will we allow cultivation facilities? We must allow dispensaries, which are the storefronts, but the other three we don't have to, and that's just going to be a policy decision that we're going to have to decide. I would say that cultivation facilities usually are located in industrial districts. You'd see them like an industrial park. They would be something like maybe a plain, nondescript, large building. You wouldn't see them commingled with businesses you see today based on the state law and the state rules that are being promulgated. They must be their own business. They can't be commingled with other retail establishments, so you couldn't just put it in a normal greenhouse. It would have to be a separate business, and the rules are very strict as to who can enter, for example, a cultivation facility. You have to have cards issued by the state, and somebody just a customer, quote unquote, off the street. And in fact, there is no retail sales from a cultivation facility. Those are essentially a wholesale operation. They're creating the product that is then sent to the dispensaries. So it's like a wholesale. So the answer is no, they would have to be separate. And would we allow them? That's really going to be a policy decision that we have to make.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk about the legalization of recreational marijuana. That's still up in the air, even though the voters did approve it on the ballot. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's the process with that?
Yeah, so at the same time, IM 26, which would legalize, it did legalize medical marijuana, was on the ballot. Amendment A was also on the ballot, which legalizes recreational marijuana, or what they would also call adult use. Some prefer to call it adult use, some prefer recreational, but either way, it's the same thing. That was passed by, I believe, about 54 to 55% of the voters. That was challenged in court, the constitutionality of that amendment, and the circuit court ruled earlier this year that it was unconstitutional based on violating the single subject rule, and then there was also a provision as to whether it was an amendment or a revision, which is a technical distinction essentially of amendments to the Constitution. And so it was declared unconstitutional. So as of today, it is unconstitutional, and so recreational will not and did not go into effect on July 1st. The Supreme Court of South Dakota heard arguments on that particular question. They have yet to rule. We have no input as to when they're going to rule on that particular subject. So as of right now, recreational is not legal, but if Amendment A was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court, it would become legal. And then of course there's many other avenues, such as there could be new voter initiatives. The state legislature may decide to do it. There is talk that they may consider doing that for various reasons. So one way or another, recreational may be coming down the road. And in many states where medical comes, recreational follows.
once the medical marijuana and all the rules and regulations are set in stone and it's up and running and maybe running smoothly, then will recreational marijuana, will it be easier to implement? Will it follow the same guidelines, or how is it completely different?
Well, that is a complex question. In theory, yes, it would be easier to implement because even as a consultant and the people in the industry will tell you 95 to 99%, something like that, of the infrastructure and the rules and everything are exactly the same because you're selling the same product ultimately. Sure. It's just the only distinction is why somebody is purchasing it. But it's the same product and it really has the same concerns and the same rules for the most part. Amendment A would say that the Department of Revenue has to create the regulations for it. As of right now, recreational could not be sold in the same stores that medical could, essentially in the way that they drafted the rules. And I think that's really probably just to essentially just kind of cover things for now until the state legislature and the Department of Revenue could kind of, if Amendment A was declared constitutional, harmonize everything and figure it out. But I think everybody probably recognizes it would be in everyone's interest, if they're both going to be legal, that they would be in the same, they'd be cultivated in the same places, they would be sold in the same stores and all of that, rather than having two of everything. You know, if it's going to be legal, just have it in one place. And that's not atypical in other states where you'll have what's called dual use licenses. And so somebody would enter a store potentially, if it's legal in both cases, and if they have a medical card, they may have access to certain strengths that might be a little bit higher than what you can buy recreationally. There might be kind of like going to a pharmacy where you see things, and this is not a pharmacy, but where you see things behind the counter that are only if you have a prescription, in this case a written certification in your card, and other stuff that's on the other side. The tax rates can be different, where maybe you have less tax for the medical, but ultimately it's the same product, and you're going into the same store. So I would suspect ultimately, if Amendment A was declared constitutional, or it was somehow became legal one way or another, both departments would work together, the state would work together, and city governments would work to make it so that it was available in the same locations. And then you don't have to worry about two different sets of regulations. And I think as just a policy standpoint, it would completely make sense to regulate them all the same. They all have the same issues and the same concerns, which is again the diversion to minors, and it's a controlled substance, so instead of just having two tiers, it would just be essentially a medical or a marijuana establishment. What are the rules? So
what does this mean for the tax structure at the beginning, whether it's medical marijuana or adult use marijuana?
Yeah, so in IM 26, we can charge a reasonable fee, and that's not a tax, but we can charge a reasonable fee for a license. It's not defined what reasonable is, so each local government is going to have to make that decision. $5,000 is allowed to be charged by the state, and they would charge that for a license, for the state license. As far as the taxes go, we've been instructed that since marijuana is not a drug, it's not approved by the FDA, it would not be tax exempt. It would be treated as just any other ordinary retail purchase. So it would be subject to just ordinary sales tax. So we would just get 2 pennies of the 6.5% of the 6.5 cents per dollar, and then the state would get the 4.5. The Amendment A contemplates something different. It does contemplate that there would be, I believe it's a 15% excise tax on recreational, the first portion going to the state to recover the cost of implementing the program, and then half to the school systems, to education, and the other half to the state's general fund. And I'm not sure what, if anything, we would get locally. I think that would have to be yet determined.
Okay. When in talking to law enforcement, is the legalization of recreational marijuana, does that prevent arrests? Would that free jail space? Will it cause more? What is the consensus on this, or does it create more court appearances? Well,
to be fair, those questions are very hotly debated. There's advocates of both positions on that, but what law enforcement will tell you, and what we've heard from other states, is that the black market does not go away. no matter what, there's always going to be a black market, whether it be the black market creating maybe stronger strengths of THC content than you can get at the stores because people want something stronger, or having something where it's not taxed, so you have something that's maybe more or they charge less on the street, you know, all of those different things. You still have the issues of course, as with any controlled substance, some, you know, like with alcohol, some people may use it, you know, responsibly, but unfortunately there's a lot of downsides of that. There may be a perception as a controlled substance becomes legal that it's perceived as safer, and so you have more usage and you have more youth trying it, and there's permanent impacts to their brain development, and so you still are going to have issues. And so at least what we're hearing from law enforcement and from what I've seen, I don't think you can assume that, you know, that problems are just going to go away. Will they get worse? I think that remains to be seen, but I don't think you know, you're going to suddenly see much of a change. In fact, there could be some, you know, there's going to be some issues for the county, and I think, you know, that law enforcement would push back on the notion that there are people being jailed routinely for low-level drug offenses. That's just not happening. So that's one of the arguments, is that, you know, people are being, you know, jailed for small amounts of marijuana, and in the real world that really isn't happening.
Okay. Well, this is a lot to talk about, and I'm sure we'll hear much more of it as it is all sorted through and as it becomes legal. Is there anything else going on at the city front that you want to touch on? We've got about a minute and a half left.
Yeah, so regarding the timelines, this summer we will need to bring ordinances forward, zoning ordinances and other ordinances, essentially a package that would address the implementation of marijuana locally. And so we're making those decisions as to what that's going to look like. That would come forward probably in August to our planning commission, and then they would be at the city council the end of August and then the beginning of September, so that it was legally effective by October 1st, which would make the timeline that licenses would be issued by the state, so that people would have to get a license from us, follow our rules, put them in locations that we think are acceptable, and we would have the proper oversight.
Okay. And if anybody wants to get a hold of you, if they have any questions or comments or want to talk more about anything else going on in the city, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can call 605-367-8109, which is my city council phone, or G. Neitzer at siouxfalls.org, or just go out to siouxfalls.org to the city council page. You can see all of our pictures, click on my picture, and you can find the contact info there.
Sure, and I don't have to say it. You can always find everything you want about the city on siouxfalls.org. So there we go. All right, well, thank you for joining us. And that's it for this episode of Inside Town Hall. We'll see you next month.